Thanks to CIA for organizing this dialogue. This is my last year also. I was here having a conversation with Lieutenant General Brar. And it's a pleasure to be here talking to Ambassador Pangatsaran. I'm always personally very keen to listen to his insights on geopolitics, especially with regard to Russia, Ukraine, crisis and other pressing geopolitical issues. So to begin with, let's talk about Trump, the Trump presidency, because when Trump became president in 2016, when he got elected, that was kind of a paradigm shift in the way the United States was looking at the world. So he started a trade war. He brought in this America First foreign policy, etc., etc. This was kind of he was signaling that globalization, free trade, that era was coming to an end. And in between, you had the Biden administration, and Biden did not reverse the Trump tariffs on China. He stayed the course, and now Trump is back. So again, we are witnessing major disruptions in U.S. foreign policy. Trump had threatened to impose sanctions on Mexico and Canada, which he has posed for now. He has already imposed sanctions on China, and he has threatened to take over Panama Canal, Greenland, etc., etc. So when you look at his foreign policy, do you see that globalization is practically over? Are we back into some kind of new era of mercantilism, economic nationalism, protectionism, etc., etc.?
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Stanley, and thank you to CII for inviting me. It's a delight to actually be in the Madras Regimental Center, and it's such a fantastic location. So it's a marvelous experience. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been a really worthwhile journey. So yeah, Trump is a big subject today. Everyone's trying to decode him, understand him. So I'll just talk firstly about the globalization part, and I think maybe down the road we can discuss his broader contours of the way his mind thinks. But on globalization, of course, Dr. Ahluwalia is sitting right in front of me. But I would say that for all practical purposes, we have reached a post-globalization era in the world. Globalization, as we understood it in the 80s or the 90s, in my opinion, looks very distant today. Globalization had a connotation of integration, of trade, finance, economy, but also culture and values. And I think over the last 5 years or so, it has been torn apart. So I think, particularly in this audience as business, I think we have to be prepared for a rough ride ahead that is going to be marked by fragmentation of everything that was built up, and equally a huge amount of business uncertainty about which way we are going to go. Clearly, if you look at some of the speeches, and I had this very nice quotation, which, if you permit, I would like to read from Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State, in his confirmation hearing to the Senate. And it'll just give us a first-hand account of what the current administration is thinking about the whole question of how to order the world. And he says, and which is very evocative, one of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged in a out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus that we have reached the end of history, that all nations of earth would become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the, quote, liberal world order, and that all that mankind was now destined to abandon national identity, and we would become one human family and citizens of the world. This resonates like the Vasudev Kutumbakam. Basically, he's saying, then he says, this wasn't just a fantasy, it was a dangerous delusion. This is the US Secretary of State talking about the liberal world order. Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed industrial capacity, and pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and rivals. This is the current sitting Secretary of State, and that's the answer to your question, insofar as what Trump and his men believe in the world and how this. So, what we are seeing, of course, is, and this happened in Trump 1.0, but it continued in the Biden administration when you had the twin shocks of the pandemic and the Ukraine war. And so today we are at an era of weaponization of everything, of trade flows, of capital flows, of financial flows, of economic flows. We are now replaced the word globalization. It's almost like the word non-alignment, which is now being hardly used. But we are now moving to terminology which talks about trusted supply chains, value chains, etc. And my last point, and I'll just stop here, is that the primary beneficiary of the globalization era was China. And so the integration which the West wanted and the reinforcement they wanted of the Western liberal order actually led only to the emergence and the creation of China. And this is what Rubio says. While America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continue to act the way countries have and always will in what they perceive to be their best interest. The premium, clearly, and I think maybe we'll come down to that issue also, is unabashed national interest. Now, you can define it in any other word. And then he says, we welcome the Chinese Communist Party. And this is again very interesting to note, the reference to the Chinese Communist Party in the Trump 1.0, he and his men went after the Chinese Communist Party because the objective, which came out quite clearly, was that we are not against the people of China, we are against the Chinese Communist Party, and we are in the business of bringing that down. So it's very interesting that within the first 15 days of the Trump administration, we find a revival of the usage of the term Chinese Communist Party and the description of Xi Jinping, not as the president of China, but as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Anyway, we welcome the Chinese Communist Party into this global order. And they took advantage of all its benefits, but they ignored all its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have lied, cheated, hacked, and stolen their way to global superpower status at our expense. So, when you ask the question whether globalization is over, and if we understand by the term globalization a US project to organize the world in a certain way, I think the answer is here. They think it's dead.
What does it mean for India? Two angles. One, what does it mean for India's ties with the United States? Or what does it mean for India's standing or continued rise in this era of post-globalization?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we are entering an area and a period of the unknown. We grew up in the last few decades assuming a certain comfort of the way the world was arranged. So there are going to be both opportunities and risks. And I would say here, the new warriors in this game are going to be businesses and the corporates, many of whom are sitting here, who had chosen to not engage or not educate themselves about the geopolitics of the way the world worked. Today, that luxury is simply over. You have someone like Elon Musk, who is the master strategist. I mean, business, industry, trade, politics have all unfortunately come together. And so today, when you talk about businesses, especially with multinational linkages, you have to take into account business risk. So you have to firstly educate yourself. You cannot afford the luxury of saying, I'm just worried about my balance sheet, but I don't want to spend my time understanding how the world works. So the first lesson for us is we need to re-skill ourselves as business leaders. We have to understand that today the fate of a nation cannot be decided only by the government. There are many more stakeholders today, and so the government has to reach out. Business leaders themselves have to educate themselves. So there is risk, I will say, there's heightened risk for India, because one approach, one way to answer your question is to talk about India. India is a concept, is an entity, but it means little below the headline. India is constituted by its micro level actors, all of whom, when they put together, they then chart the course for the nation as a whole. So I would say we are going to be facing headwinds. So there will be, on balance, more risk, I would say, than opportunity in the short term, till such time as we master the game and we start becoming cleverer at leveraging opportunities that arise, and the opportunities will arise. So if there is a US-China trade war, the question which everyone should be asking in the room and otherwise is then, where do we fit in terms of our opportunities, in terms of our export markets, in terms of capturing Chinese markets, in terms of using the trade war between US and China to get in our own value chains and integrate with, let's say, Western economies. Or, for example, the way we used opportunity to purchase oil and energy from Russia at a time when the war was at its peak. So there will be opportunities, but there will be risks, and those will come from weaponization. As I said, if you cannot conduct business, if you can't make payments, if you're going to be under sanctions, territorial, extraterritorial, if you're going to be under political pressures, all of these. But what we have to do is to then locate markets for our exports. We have to locate capital for investments into India. So we have to learn the game afresh. We have to be also more conscious of the kind of value chains and supply chains we are entering, in terms of resilience, in terms of being able to withstand political shocks. So I would say this is going to be a mixed bag. It's difficult at this point to say whether we can make a definitive judgment, whether we are better off in an era without globalization. It also depends a lot on how we, as I said, reskill, rejig our national structures, how nimble-footed our corporates are, our strategic experts are, to understand this very changing and sharply changing reality. But if the driver of the global order is thinking the way I just read out, then every day of the next 4 years is going to be tumultuous. And it is going to be, so every morning you'll have to open the newspaper and ask yourself, what is the latest news from Washington? And so in this era of uncertainty, we are not sure of anything. If I use the word trade war between the United States and China, I'm not even sure if that's an accurate description of the situation. So when you talked about the tariffs on China, it's just the beginning of the long game. So that's the answer to your question.
You referred to the Ukraine war. So Trump, during his campaign, had promised that he would bring the war to an end. And after he assumed office, he said that he basically wanted to talk about the war with the Russian leader. Then he said that if the Russians do not make any concessions, he would put more sanctions on Russia or tariffs on Russia, etc., etc. So two things about the war. One, can you give us a brief update on where exactly the war stands today? There are conflicting narratives. The Russians are making gains on the ground, but Ukraine continues to attack Russia from the air using drones, etc. And then secondly, is there a realistic possibility for a ceasefire now that Trump is in the White House?
Yeah, so Stanley, on the first part, on the battlefield situation. Now, the thing is that a lot of the material and the information we get is from Western sources. I mean, we have very little access to primary and accurate sources about what's going on. But in the last few months, I've been interacting many times with many of the Europeans and the Americans, and I'll just quote to you what they tell me about the battlefield situation. But our own independent assessment is that the battlefield situation has changed every year since 2022. 22 there was one, 23 there was another reality, 24 another, and now we're in another reality. So some of the common kind of refrains, because there's a lot of disagreement even among them, the Westerners, the Europeans, within the Europeans and the Americans, etc. But I would say the consensus by and large is that this is really not a war for territory. It is a part and parcel of a much larger geopolitical project to either protect or to promote geostrategic advantage and change, and alter and settle some issues which have been thrown out of the window, which basically is what is going to be the shape of the European security architecture, and therefore what is going to be the shape of the global security architecture. I want to read out another very interesting, I don't have it here. Again, Mark Rubio was asked, and he said, the era of a unipolar world is dead. This is an American Secretary of State, and he talks about, he uses the word multipolar world. So on the battlefield, just to come back, this is a war of attrition. If it is a war of attrition, the Russians will win, for the simple reason of the difference in the two countries, in the sizes and the resource endowments. Number three, the estimates of losses vary widely depending on who you ask. I mean, I picked up some statistics. There are statistics about Russian losses between 400,000 to 700,000 men. There are estimates of Ukrainian losses of about 50,000 men and another 400,000 injured. This is a statement by Zelensky himself. A few months ago, so between 22 to 24, in my opinion, the Russians have achieved mostly what they wanted. They wanted a buffer zone or a sliver of territory separating Ukraine and Russia on the east of Ukraine, and they have achieved it, and they've got it. They control it from Donbass right down to Crimea in varying degrees of control, but they have it there. They're sitting there. Many of the Europeans believe that they will not be able to evict the Russians, and that effectively the Russians occupy about 20% of Ukrainian territory. And there is more or less reconciliation that they will not succeed in throwing the Russians out. The Ukrainians opened a new front in Kursk a few months ago, and I've been to Kursk, very close to the border. I've traveled as ambassador. It's just flat land. You can't see the horizon. It's just vast expanse, empty, trees, lush green, but not a human being to be seen. And that was the site of the famous Battle of Kursk, the tank battle, the biggest battle of the tank battle in the world. So the Ukrainians made a rapid advance. The Russians have thrown up the Ukrainians by almost 50%. So the battlefield situation is of exhaustion. A couple of weeks ago, we were with some Americans. Their assessment is that this is one of those situations like the World War I, where the Ukrainians are on the verge of a military collapse. And it is imminent. It will just happen. The attrition war is being won by the Russians. So they are all reconciled to the fact that for all practical purposes, Ukraine is losing, and the collapse will happen suddenly. It will be sudden, and it will be dramatic. So that's the battlefield situation. And the other thing
Ceasefire, possibility
yes,
of ceasefire.
I am convinced, this is my view, that in the next 6 months and definitely 2025, you will see the end of the war. My bet would be mostly in the next 6 months, if not earlier. It's a typical Trumpian approach to problem solving. One of the great things about him, he revels in complexity. He hates simple solutions, he hates simple problems. You give him and throw him the toughest problem, that's what he chews on. That's his, his menu for the day. But there's method in the madness. And what is going to happen, and the Europeans are the ones who are the most nervous about a deal happening above their heads, where he sits across the table with Putin, eye to eye, face to face, which is what Putin wants. He wants that respect, to be treated as an equal. And he's going to tell him, listen, this is the deal. Enough is enough. Stop it. And if you don't stop it, you don't know what you're getting into. So there will be that threat. But so the elements of a solution are well known. I mean, everyone knows why the war happened and how it can be ended. So I believe that you use the word ceasefire. It could be an armistice. It could be a halt. These are all technical terms. But I'm not saying you will find a solution to the conflict, which is a much bigger issue. But if you're talking about the limited issue of seizure of war, that is going to be quite possible. It will be untidy, but it is possible to do. And the method in the madness is that he actually believes, and he said it many, many times in his public campaign, and even as the president-elect on the inauguration, America does not need this war. We should not be in it. We have other fish to fry. Why are we subsidizing the richest continent on the planet, Europe, to fight this war? He says, I have other things to do to protect America, and I've read out, in his mind, you have to fix China. The rest, he wants to set aside. So there is that, in the midst of all the kind of cacophony that we hear from him, he has reduced to this very simple view of the world, which is also in some ways profound, that if America has to achieve its greatness again, it has to fix the China issue. So, and he thinks the Russia war is not a core US interest. And the problem is, and it's not a problem, he himself knows that in doing so and in thinking this way, the people the feathers he is ruffling the most are his own NATO allies. So we have an extraordinary situation where Europe doesn't know where to go. But that's not going to prevent him from moving forward, because he's so far committed. And as far as my assessment is concerned, Putin is ready. Putin is ready to make a deal. That's how I see it.
So let's also briefly talk about the economic consequences of the war. There are biting sanctions on Russia, which prompted Russia to pivot to the east. And you have also seen India and China basically ramping up their economic and trade ties with Russia over the past uh, 3 years. Incidentally, the war began almost 3 years ago. And on the other side, Europe, which joined the sanctions, has also taken some major economic setback. For example, the deindustrialization Germany is witnessing today. So my question is, if you look at the economic consequences of the war from New Delhi, what do you see? Are you seeing an opportunity for India in in India ramping up its energy ties with Russia, or are you seeing that India will come under greater pressure from the West and this will impact our larger growth trajectory?
The answer is both and all of the above. And the question, of course, will depend on whether we are talking short term, medium term, or long term. I mean, if we are talking immediate, then clearly the energy example stands before us, where there was a major disruption. And I think we did a great job in leveraging the war and securing our energy supplies and becoming the largest exporter of petroleum products to Europe. So I think we did very well there. But what is going to happen is that with the Western sanctions on Russia, despite Russia's inclination to the contrary, they are being pushed into the Chinese economic fold. And so with Western companies and all walking out of Russia, there is a vacuum. And it's not as if the Russian elite, the St. Petersburg and these other guys, they like the Chinese or they like BYD and they want their BMWs, they want their Mercedes, they want the Western European lifestyle. That's the white Caucasian Russian, rich. So if they pivot to China, it's not out of choice. But the Chinese, being the Chinese, they have just flooded in. The entire automobile sector today is taken over by Chinese luxury cars. And this is happening in sector after sector. So we find a situation where Russia is getting sucked into the Chinese economic universe. China is getting cheap oil. So China has an extra market that has fallen on its lap. And on the other side, the side which actually tried to integrate with Russia, and Russia tried to integrate with it, with its Western front, Europe, the war has resulted, as you said, in the deindustrialization of Europe. And this is a price that Europe is paying. It's a heavy price. And the consequences of this are going to last for a full generation, because it has kind of shaken the foundations of European prosperity. The United States obviously is in trouble also economically. So when it comes to us, we can kind of throw a lifeline out to the Europeans in terms of providing them a market, another market for their products. They are keen to ramp up their economic relationship with India. That's an advantage. The Chinese are also trying to hedge against American threat, reaching out to us, advantage India. The Russians are clearly desperate for markets, for everything that they can be used to bail them out, advantage India. So in many ways, I would say, to answer your question, the fallout of the Ukraine war, in some senses, could be considered to be advantage India in the medium term. In the short term, I know a lot of our businesses are not able to enter Russia. But if we hold out too long, you will find that there won't be any space left in Russia, because the Chinese would have taken it over. And this applies most and importantly and strategically to the whole question of natural resources, mineral resources, energy and oil, which we need for the next 25 years.
So let's move to West Asia. Try to understand West Asia. I mean, what is happening in the region, especially for the last 15 months? The Hamas attack, Israel's retaliatory war, the war between Israel and Hezbollah, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and the strikes and counter-strikes between Israel and Iran. Now Trump is coming in. He wants to own Gaza. Just tell us what's happening.
Well, it's extraordinary because I was reading your book, The Original Sin, and I've carried it with me. And I would recommend this book to everyone in the room who wants to understand history, because West Asia history has such an overload, even among a 10-year-old boy and a 10-year-old generation, that it's not funny. And Stanley's book tells you where it all began. And when you understand the history, you will understand West Asia. And the title of this book is The Original Sin. And of course, our great friends, the British, have a fundamental role to play in the disaster that is West Asia today. But so there is a lot going on, and there's no time to unravel this whole puzzle. But all I'll say is, from the point of view of this audience, let's come down to, the brass tacks, the practical implications. What do you want from there? You want to ensure that your goods have safe passage to Europe through the sea lines of communication, through the trading routes, through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea. Because if you don't, your insurance costs go up, your business uncertainties go up. So flare-ups there affect us in a very, very real fashion. Second, so you need peace and security there. The problem is that it's not in your hands. If there is a problem between ungoverned spaces and the rebels and the Houthis and the Saudis and the Yemenis, you have very little to do and very little to contribute to preventing this from happening, except to use diplomatic pressure, moral suasion, etc. Of course, there has been a sea change in the last 2 years where the Indian Navy has actually deployed military strength, naval power in the Gulf of Aden and the Gulf of near Somalia and so on. This is new. It's never happened in Indian history. So one is trading routes. Second, from a audience point of view, you want to just make sure that your energy supplies are secure. 50% or more of your energy, I think, come from Iraq, Saudi, and UAE. And you just want to make sure you get the energy and you don't have to pay $150 per barrel for it. So that's energy. The third is investments. You want to have access to those sovereign funds, whether it's in the UAE or in Saudi. So you want to make sure that they remain liquid and they remain ready to invest in India. Fourthly, you want to make sure that 9 million Indians continue to get the opportunity to work there, to earn their money, and to remit that money into India so that they can support 9 multiplied by 4, 36, 40 million Indians. So these are our real interests in the West Asian conflict. And these go to the heart of our bread and butter issues. The rest is luxury, where we can analyze the political games that are being played. But even here, if you notice, I have been repeatedly talking about the Gulf. For some reason, I didn't talk about Iran, I didn't talk about Israel, or maybe Syria, or Iraq. Iraq I did. But there also we have big interests. I mean, what kind of forces do you want that should govern those countries? Do you want secular forces of the kinds we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s? Or are you okay with Islamist forces governing territory after territory? What is India's interest? To have Shia domination or to have a Sunni domination of the region? What is in our interest? Do we want a strong, secure Israel? Do we want the Palestinian issue to be solved? Is there something we can do to actually provide a solution? These are the issues which are too big to discuss in 3-4 minutes. But I would say, so we have economic, energy, diaspora, but we also have very serious security interests, both when it comes to the India-Israel relationship, as well as the kind of the emergence or the resurgence of Islamic extremism and radicalization, because of the fact that if you have 250 million Muslims in India, this is not academic, it will impact you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks for your kind words on Original Sin. So shall we take one round of questions, at least 3 questions, so that, yeah, quick, yes, 3 questions, and then maybe Ambassador can answer them quickly. We'll take the questions and then we will wrap it up. Yes. Second question. Yes.
So my question, Ambassador, is Indians were amongst the happiest when Trump won. Can you explain that?
Last question.
So,
You talked about U.S. Policy and how they don't want to look outwards and start looking inside. But if you think about where U.S. is today, $38 trillion in debt, where with a 6% interest rate, the interest rate amounts to $1 trillion, which is equal to the defense budget. So they have no possibility of going through another fiscal stimulus, which means it's imperative that they have to clean house inside before they start pushing outside. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So Afghanistan, Pakistan, on Afghanistan and Pakistan, there was a lot of churning in the Indian strategic community in August 2021 when the Americans left, and you know how they left. And they handed it over to the Taliban. The Kabul just collapsed like a house of cards. And the feeling was that this was a strategic victory for Pakistan because they had achieved their ultimate goal of having strategic depth in Afghanistan, because the Taliban had been tutored and had been nurtured in Pakistan for the last 3-4 decades. The reality today is that the breakdown of the Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship is something which no one had expected. And today we have a situation where the Pashtuns on both sides of the Durand line are literally at war with each other. The Taliban is at war with its mentors in Rawalpindi. So we have an extraordinary situation where the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship has collapsed for all practical purposes. And much to Pakistan's chagrin, the Taliban are showing so many signs of wanting to come closer to India in many, many ways, that it's only us who are trying to be holding back a little bit because of our own domestic politics, etc. But left, if there were no restraints, our relationship with the Taliban-led Afghanistan would have been actually even better today. It is already fairly good, and the prospects are very good for the future. So we have a situation where the Pakistanis already are in huge, huge trouble domestically, for which I don't see any solution for this generation of Pakistanis. Because these are not like changing taxation rates or changing electricity prices. These are fundamental issues of whether Pakistan itself is a viable state. And everything is happening inside Balochistan, etc. So, and on top of that, you have this problem with Afghanistan. So I think that theater, the Western theater, is in a state of acute turmoil, and that's how it's going to be. On the question of Trump, you're absolutely right. I think if there was any rejoicement about his victory, it was in India. I don't think even the Americans rejoiced as much. I mean, there were huge sections of the American population who were completely distraught and thought this is the end of the world. But the point is, we have to realize that, if he's saying make America great again, it doesn't mean make India great again. Many of our cheerleaders forget this. They think that by him saying make America great again means somehow that we also will be basking in that glory. So I don't understand why. I do understand why a lot of Indians were happy with that kind of ideology he brought, or his policies. But it's important for us, these are early days, not even 1 month since his swearing in, to understand who he is. He's basically from your community. He's a businessman. Not only is he a businessman, he's a real estate agent. And a very successful one. So if among you have real estate agents here, maybe the foreign minister of India or the foreign minister for the United States should be our own counterpart of a real estate agent, to understand how he believes and how he thinks. For him, every problem is a business deal. So we have to be prepared. And in this model, there are no friends, there are no foes, as we are discovering with Canada, Mexico, Panama, Europe. I mean, the Chinese are sitting there and laughing, and they're saying, you know, this turmoil was supposed to be targeted at us. But, and of course, we have been facing a lot of the heat in the last few weeks. We will continue to. But one of the things which is true is that in his perception, the primary problem for the United States and the global order is China. And so from that perspective, there is a lot of strategic convergence between him and us. Very much unlike the Biden people, who were basically bureaucrats. I mean, who had the same thing, but they were not as focused. I mean, they expended so much energy, political capital, everything, on the Russia business, that, and so Trump is trying to do that correction. On the isolationism, yeah, I mean, in fact, I can't find it here. It's, there was this, you know, again, this Rubio talked about isolationism, and he says in one section, placing our core national interests above all else is not isolationism. It is the common sense realization that a foreign policy centered on our national interest is not some outdated relic. You know, people had accused our Prime Minister and others of being nationalist, inward looking. Here is the President of the United States, supposed to be the most internationalist country, and his people are talking this language, which is like remarkable from what we've seen in the past. So I agree that they're joined at the hip with the Chinese. They have their debt, they have their imbalance with the Chinese. They can't walk out of the global economy. But you know, he has that horse sense. I mean, you know what he did? He turned the whole Biden approach to sanctions on its head. He accused Biden, of course this was their own internal political rivalry, but he firstly told Biden that Russia-Ukraine war would never have happened under my watch, that you messed it up. Second thing he told him is, because of your sanctions, people are moving away from the dollar as a currency of international settlement. And so he threatened the BRICS, of course, which he said, you know, that don't even think of having an alternate currency. So I think we will see definitely a more mercantilist United States. We cannot take for granted his willingness to part with technology to India unless it benefits him, that we become part of his, you know, his supply chain and become a multiplier effect for his economy. And he will be a very tough negotiator. I think we are being more polite to him compared to most of the European commentators and even heads of state. If you listen to the way they talk about Trump, it's quite extraordinary.
Thank you, sir. I would love to continue the discussion, but our time is up. So thanks for your insights. So with this, I'll bring the session to an end. Thank you very much, everybody.